Welcome to the DuBois-Robeson People Center. If you have not been here before, welcome to this book talk. The only three things I'll say logistics-wise before we get started. One, there's a bathroom. It's at the back on the left if you need to go to the bathroom. Two, if you're able to, make a donation to Amistad Law Project. We really just want to support abolitionist work when we're thinking about all of this together. Hi, Ra. And some of the work they do, you might know, with Treatment Not Trauma, which tries to make it so there's not carceral responses to mental health issues. So I have their little donate thing here. You don't have to do it right this second. You can do it at the end. I'll put it up as well. And then also we have copies of the book at the back if you'd like to purchase. I'll probably bring them actually in the front room at the end. And with that, I'll introduce Kevin, who's going to introduce our author.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us. I'll keep this short. So Menika Dirkson is a Philadelphia native and assistant professor of African American history at Morgan State University. She received her PhD in history from Temple University. She also got her MA at Villanova, where I went. Her research focuses on police-black community relations in Philadelphia following the Civil Rights era. She's currently researching race, policing, and graffiti surrounding the public transportation system in post-1958 Philadelphia. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Menika Dirkson.
Thank you. Okay, so I have some notes, and the rest I'm going to just freestyle and talk about it. Okay. So first I want to thank Bradley, Emma, and Kevin for inviting me to give this talk here and help fundraise for the Amistad Law Project. I hope to make this talk impactful to all and encourage everyone to look beyond their racial, cultural, and neighborhood affiliations and see racially distinct issues as city issues that affect us all and should matter to us all. So to be frank, I'm talking about how gun violence and mass incarceration are often stereotypically viewed as solely a black problem. Something that only happens in black communities, like there's some defect in black culture that makes it so common among African Americans, as if black culture is inferior to white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American culture. And it's something that I grapple with in this book. So now that I got that off my chest, I'm going to throw a wrench in this presentation that the planning committee didn't really know about. And talk about how, when we're talking about issues of crime and policing, yes, there is the issue of personal responsibility that plays a major role in why some people end up in the carceral system. But another major reason why we have so many people locked away in prisons and the grave is because of divisive behaviors like aversive racism, the stereotyping and criminalization of people of color, and we can loosely define that depending on what decade we're talking about in American history. And in additionally, white flight, deindustrialization, job flight, government defunding of social welfare programs, and excessive spending on tough on crime policing. So writing this book had me thrown in different places. So when I started it, I was in a master's program at Temple, at Villanova, and I didn't know what I wanted to write. I didn't know if I wanted to teach K through 12 or if I wanted to teach college. And thank you, Kevin. And at one point I figured, let me just do African American history. There's been stories about police involved shootings, about Trayvon Martin and other individuals that were killed by police or Neighborhood Watch. And I figured I want to know more about this. I had no negative experiences with the police. I'm trying to figure out, is there really, I know it's a dumb question, is there really an issue with racially biased policing? And so I started doing some research. So I'm a big fan of the 70s, and this was one of the albums, which you can see pictured here, that I ruminated on to kind of get myself into the culture of the 1970s and understand the issues of that time period. But because I'm a big fan of the 70s, I focused on the 70s and actually stumbled across this law document from the Public Interest Law Center of Philadelphia. which referred to itself at the time as PILCOP. So PILCOP was this pro bono civil rights organization that basically took on cases related to housing discrimination, job discrimination, policing issues, and so on. And in the 1970s, the attorney Anthony Jackson actually decided to research police-involved shootings because it was an issue that was well known in the public since the 1950s in Philadelphia. So he looked through newspaper articles. In some cases, people came to their situation. They came to their facility or their law office to basically report cases that they wanted defended on their behalf. And Anthony Jackson basically looked through these documents, he looked through newspaper articles, collected all of these police-involved shootings, and determined that from 1970 to 1978, there were 469 police-involved shootings that occurred in Philadelphia. So about 66% of the people that were shot and killed by the police were black, and at that time, Philadelphia was 33% black. So clearly there's a serious issue there. It's doubled. And as a result of that, you have them wanting to publicize it and also pursue cases. So during PILCOP's tenure, especially after this police project that was established in the 1970s, they sent letters to the police commissioner, who at the time was Joseph O'Neill. They also contacted Rizzo. In some ways, there were other organizations like PILCOP that held town hall meetings. The Pennsylvania Commission even got involved at one point and basically helped held these town hall meetings and keep transcripts and pages of records about what citizens reported about police improprieties and abuses on the streets, in the police station, in the interrogation room. So looking at all of those documents and starting in the 70s, I decided this was going to be my project. I was going to look at police-involved shooting. I was going to look at the late 60s into the 70s, and basically looking through these documents that consisted of interviews, oral histories, newspapers, housing project pamphlets, maps, of course other books, looking at PILCOP's records, and there's a lot more that I also looked at in regard to primary sources. But looking at this, I realized I couldn't just stay in the 70s, but I had to also go into the 1920s. And begin the story there. So this story, and I'll briefly go over it, but in the book I talk about how this criminalization of black people in cities like Philadelphia starts around the time of the Great Migration. So having millions of people from 1916 to 1970, so approximately 6.6 million, travel mainly by train but also by car and by foot, going up north from southern states and sometimes going to the Midwest and going out west. You have all of these people traveling, looking for homes, for jobs, and new lives outside of the segregated Jim Crow South. And during the World Wars that happened in, of course, the 1910s and then also the 1940s, you have a pickup of industrial jobs happening in the North. And some of these jobs are even offering housing to migrants in the South. And there was also an immigration kind of stoppage as well into the U.S. So having Southern black migrants as workers was pretty much ideal for many northern industrial factories. So having all of these people move up north, many newspapers, even some city officials, everyday people, were spreading this idea of there being a black invasion, to have all these black people come up north. And it's around that time that you have not just pushback from black people moving into black neighborhoods and schools, which leads to riots, leads to police activity, and often biased policing, but having communities be not only segregated but also facing defunding over time because the populace is changing in these cities. So for cities like Philadelphia, so prior to 1920, the black population was less than 10%. And then as you heard earlier, by the 1970s, it jumps to over 30%. So today, Philadelphia's black population is over 40%. So we're kind of like a black-white city, 50, not 50-50, but close to it. So having all those people move up north, as you can see with this map, it's changing the way the society runs. So you're having more black people in schools, in residential neighborhoods, and also using recreational spaces like playgrounds and rec centers. So for my family, they actually came from Maryland, South Carolina, and Alabama. My great-grandparents were from Alabama and South Carolina, and in the 1920s, they went to Virginia, so specifically Norfolk. And then by around 1927, when my grandmother was born, they moved to Philadelphia. So having families like that and black families often settling in South Philadelphia, where housing was cheap, where it was redlined, and often alongside other immigrants, and then having some housing, cheap housing, segregated housing, open up in North Philly, and then eventually West Philly, you see that there becomes some tension and also police activity as well. So to kind of jump a little bit ahead, so after World War II, you have in which there is some gang activity amongst juveniles. So of course there's crime, of course there's segregation, and more middle class people are coming into the city and having these jobs. But there becomes this serious issue with gang activity among teenagers. So in some cases, these kids are as young as 8. Well, mainly they're being recruited as young as 8. And some of them are as old as their early 20s, so like 21, 23, and some of them will eventually age out of gang activity when they graduate school, get a job, start a family. So having youth in that age group active in different neighborhoods, and in some cases you have youth somewhat protecting these segregated boundaries in neighborhoods. So in Philadelphia, there being white gangs, being black gangs, and other gangs as well. So white gangs like the Green Street Counts, having gangs like the K&A, so represent Kensington and Allegheny, and also other black gangs that would develop like Valley, 8th and Diamond Streeters, and so on. So having these gangs develop, and largely because there's a lack of recreation, there's a lack of mentorship, and there's also this need for finances. So some of these youth are living in households where their parents are constantly working for cheap and dilapidated housing. So outside of school hours, there's no supervision. If they're in a neighborhood where recreation is segregated or lacking, then they're not able to use proper facilities. And as a result, they hang out on the streets, they get into trouble, they commit crimes, and sometimes it's poverty-induced crime, which included robbery. So you have police that are starting to map out the different gangs in the city. And just to speed a little bit ahead of 1945, by the 1960s, Philadelphia becomes well known for gangs, to the point where New York finally gives us some credit for something. I mean, it's negative, but they call us the gang capital of America in the New York Times in 1969 because we had the most gang-related homicides. So it was 45. And by the time we got into the 1970s, we had over 200 juvenile gangs in the city. So we're talking about gangs majorly in North Philly and South Philly and West Philly, and sometimes these gang territories are overlapping each other to the point where there's gang fights happening sometimes in broad daylight. So not just with guns and knives, but even zip guns. So these makeshift weapons or guns where youth are taking car antennas, they're taking pipes, they're taking blocks of wood, and they're finding a way to get bullets and tacks, and they're using them to make guns and engage in shootouts in the streets. So sometimes they're not just injuring and killing each other, but also innocent people that included adults and children. So having that issue on the streets, you had for generations city or community members, former gang members, and sometimes police and social workers who got involved to stop this gang violence, and to a greater extent tried to solve the issue of poverty and crime. So some of the organizations that I do talk about in this book, and I won't tell too many details so that you will read it. In the 1920s, you had settlement houses in South Philly. They created the Whittier Center, which was started by white Quakers, and black social workers often got involved. And in around 1930, a white Quaker woman named Helen Corson wanted to create the Wharton Center in North Philadelphia, not far from Temple University, and she actually consulted W.E.B. Du Bois on how to put the Wharton Center together. So with his help, his advice, she recruited other middle-class white and black Philadelphians. She wanted mainly black leadership to run the center, so including black social workers, black nurses, and also black college students that were interested in social welfare. So one of the people that I talk about is a man named W. Barber, who eventually became a housing activist in California. So people like Barber, who was from Temple University, he actually was a gang worker in the 1940s, and he used to hang out on street corners and try to recruit youth and bring them into the Wharton Center. So the picture that is like a periwinkle, bluish, purplish color, that's an image from around 1930 of the Wharton Center community. So you have settlement houses that are existing. They're offering mentorship, job training, recreation, all kinds of sports. They're also offering educational classes and basically trying to bring in youth for daycare programs, summer camps, and even art programs to basically give them something to do. One of the other projects that they established was getting youth to clean up vacant lots to make into playgrounds. So you have other institutions that turn around and do the same thing. So in the 1960s and 70s, you had a bunch of anti-gang programs that popped up. In West Philadelphia, Herman Rice, he was a former gang member. He was a military veteran, a graduate of Temple University. And while he was working as a lab technician, he decided to create the Young Great Society. And the picture that is green is representing members of the Young Great Society. So when Herman Rice created the Young Great Society, he worked with Andrew Jenkins, his friend and neighbor, and they started the organization because their wives actually went out one night to go to the neighborhood store, and they almost were injured or killed by a gunfight that happened between two gangs in their neighborhood. So with the Young Great Society, they established recreational programs that included a football program. They offered a daycare center to working mothers who wanted to attend night school. They connected with housing projects in West Philadelphia to offer different types of recreation. They offered job training. They sent youth at one point to Puerto Rico to learn about gang issues and experience time out of their neighborhood and away from gang activity. And other programs followed suit as well throughout Philadelphia. So in the picture that is red or orange, you see an image of Arlen Specter, who was the DA of Philadelphia. And in the late 60s, he decided to start a program called Safe Streets, Inc. So he actually consulted with President Nixon about how to go about it. And he learned that he should consider getting funding from the LEAA program, or the Law Enforcement Assistance Program. So the same government organization that gave out funding to police departments to militarize their forces. So with Arlen Specter's Safe Streets Inc., he recruited community members, former gang members, and social workers, and basically they offered similar programming to the Young Great Society. They offered job training, educational classes, recreation. They offered therapy sessions. They even took youth to New York to see plays for the day. They even took youth in the summer to the Poconos for recreational activities to get them out of the neighborhood. And they also established 2 centers. So one in North Philadelphia near Girard College, and another center in West Philadelphia. So around 63rd and I want to say Walnut. So I actually went over there to both locations. So I'm not as familiar with West Philly because I'm from Northwest Philly. so that's why it's a little bit cloudy for me talking about West Philly. So he establishes this program. They eventually are receiving up to half of their operating budget from the city and the LEAA program, but because of the city officials not wanting to grant so much of their money to these anti-gang programs and not seeing results quick enough, they eventually cut funding, and as a result, the organization struggled to survive and eventually closed after being open for 7 years. So you also had other individuals that stepped in and tried to help these anti-gang programs. So in the picture that you see that is colored yellow, there was a mechanic who owned a garage shop in West Philadelphia. He heard about Safe Streets Inc. and he decided he wanted to bring in some youth who would learn how to become mechanics at his garage. And he actually eventually even offered up money for transportation to have them be transported to and from the Safe Street Center to learn how to become a mechanic at their garage, at his garage. So a friend of his that also owned a mechanic garage joined him, and they ran this program in connection with Safe Streets. So even other members of the community got involved to work on this activism against gang activity, poverty, and crime. So there's a lot of images here. I'm just going to pick through a bunch of them really quickly. So you had community members who went to City Hall and made protests and demanded that the city do something about the gang issue. Some people did street protests, as you can see with the signs. You also had community members do these mass demonstrations. So in the case on the left, you see a group of mothers carrying a casket near the art museum to demonstrate how impactful in a negative way these deaths are happening in their community and affecting their youth and other members. You also had churches recruiting gang members to do cleanup projects. So in this case, the Reverend John Oduro of the Vine Street Memorial Baptist Church, he's actually getting Creek gang members to clean up graffiti, and then he's having a conversation with them, and this is around 60th and Ellsworth in 1971. So you also had, of course, police athletic league centers, but you also had college students, and Temple did play a big role in trying to solve the gang issue in Philadelphia. In the late 1960s, people like Kitty Caparella, who was an aspiring journalist, she was a journalism major at Temple, who eventually became a journalist, I believe, for the Philadelphia Daily News or the Inquirer. She worked with gang members, I think, from the Moroccos and the 12th and Oxford Street gangs in North Philly to create a gang newspaper called Dig This, which you see in the image there. So they spent summers and then even in the fall and the winter and spring having gang members learn how to write articles, to take photos. They even had a comic strip called Ebony Man that was inspired by the Black Panther Party. So you have all of these different community members finding ways to reform youth and make a difference and try to solve the problem on their own without government intervention. You even have town hall meetings at churches, at schools, at libraries. In the picture on the right, you have even everyday citizens like Betty Bradley hosting gang members in her house on Halloween in 1974, trying to get them to talk to each other, these rivals, and get them to make peace as well. So you have so many cases of citizens doing community work, trying to improve their neighborhood, finding ways when the government or the local government was gradually increasing more and more spending for police and prisons, and having people like Rizzo, who was a former police officer, police commissioner, and becoming mayor in 1972 after nearly 30 years as a police officer. It becomes a difficult feat for community activists to convince city officials who see rising crime rates and also see that there's a decline in the tax base. So the tax base where you get all of these property tax, sales tax, etc., and that pays for schools, for housing, public housing, for streets, so fire, police, snow removal, etc. So seeing a decline in that tax base, they're trying to find a way to keep the middle and upper classes in Philadelphia. So by fighting crime, and specifically black crime, it's not just serving the purpose of ending crime supposedly, but also convincing specifically the white middle and upper classes to stay in Philadelphia and be loyal taxpayers. So it becomes a difficult feat, and it doesn't really have a nice ending. So based on these numbers that you see here, and they're from a news clipping from the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, you see that from 1970 to 1976, spending on policing increased by about 90%. It was 1970s number. So a lot. And you see for prisons, it increased by 110% from the 1970 numbers. And remember, this is around the era of Rizzo. So he's largely influential during this period. So the highest that police spending of the Philadelphia budget has been is about 19%. Today it's about 15%. So other cities have seen their police spending on police and their city budgets be as high as 45% is what I've heard. And other cities have varying degrees. So thinking about how all of the spending could actually go to, well, even a portion of that spending that's going to police could go to other social welfare programs or services, is why this book is written in the manner that it is. So during Rizzo's time as mayor, he is doing some good things. So in the 1950s, city officials, city council knew that there was an issue with the tax base decreasing and there having to be a city budget being in deficit. So they're coming up with this formula of trying to expand real estate in the city. So just building and building and building. And we just had that thing with Chinatown and the arena. And this is part of that tradition of trying to build in order to garner more jobs, more taxes that will be paid towards the city budget to pay for things. So during Rizzo's time, he approves a bunch of projects, which includes major hospitals like CHOP. He sponsors the rebuilding of the subway and the L and the trolley system. He also wants tourist sites near Independence Hall rebuilt and made and a recreation to attract tourists. Even what used to be called the Gallery Mall, which is now the Fashion District, and Center City, that was a project that was undertaken during Rizzo's administration. So on one hand, there is some stuff going on to kind of boost the economy in Philly, but it's still not enough, and Rizzo is still bent on increasing the wages for police and also investing on tough on crime policing, and to the point where there is a shift from overtime for police not being just vacation hours, but now paid overtime. So because there's the incentive for police and detectives to do more hours of work with patrols, with interrogations, and also with making court appearances, so getting paid about a time and a half at over their 8-hour shift. For some of these officers, they're most likely creating crime or finding crime in order to get more paid overtime. And this is also the same time period when the Public Interest Law Center is documenting all of these police-involved shootings. So to think about that and how we still have those traditions going on to this day, and there's still the effects of people that benefited from this tough on crime era lingering on today. So if you've heard of Michael Chitwood, who was the Upper Darby superintendent, or the equivalent of police commissioner here, he actually was a police officer and detective in Philadelphia before he worked in Upper Darby. And while he was detective in Philadelphia in the 70s, he was one of these officers that made so much money from overtime. His ending salary for a year in the 70s was more than the police commissioner of Philadelphia himself. So there's no way a detective should be making twice his salary from overtime and more than the police commissioner. There's some corruption going on. And you had journalists from newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer basically discovering this, and also discovering that there were beatings, there were abuses going on in the interrogation room in order to get people to confess to crime, so whether they committed them or not. So with all of that tough on crime stuff that's going on, there are still community organizations that are working to find non-carceral solutions to poverty and crime. So Safe Streets Inc., I mentioned, had a North Philly and a West Philly center. And the North Philly center is located in Sharswood, so near Girard College. So I actually went to both locations, and if I could, I took pictures. And the location of the North Philly Safe Streets Inc. is now the North Philly Peace Park. So the row house where Safe Streets Inc. operated its center is gone. It's a vacant lot, but community members, they've renovated it and made a garden. They have like a play space. They also sell merchandise. They're even trying to create a school. But this Peace Park is supposed to be a space where there's no drugs, no weapons, nothing that would harm children or adults. And from my time talking briefly to some of the organizers, they say that people in the neighborhood still experience gun violence and crime, but people have typically respected this Peace Park and not violated any of their policies there. So when I actually told them that the anti-gang program Safe Streets existed there, they were kind of humbled. I mean, they were already humbled, but they were even more humbled to hear that they had actually established this organization on the same land that another group did, and they had no idea of that. So I'm going to end this talk, and I'm not going to read all of this stuff here, but leave this for you to simmer in anger about. But to think about, like, how we, in many cases, cities are still embracing this tough on crime initiatives. They have been hearing about the importance of reducing poverty and crime by investing in social welfare so that people aren't tempted or in such a desperate position to even be drawn to crime. But for me, doing all of this research, it led me to be cynical and realize maybe there is an incentive for there being poverty and crime in cities like Philadelphia. So we're not really doing agriculture anymore. We're not really engaging in factories in big cities like Philadelphia. We're more of a meds and eds kind of city. And in addition to that, it just led me to flat out just argue at the end of the book that maybe cities like us are profiting from the existence of crime. So the fact that there is crime, there's people to arrest, there's people to incarcerate, there's people to put into hospitals, to put in the grave. It's providing middle and upper class jobs for doctors, for lawyers, for judges, for police officers, for morticians, for funeral directors. And if they're willing to stay in the city and pay taxes then to have crime in the city is good for the tax base, sadly. And as you can see, Philadelphia is one of the top carceral cities, not just in, I mean, of course in the country, but even in the Northeast. And again, we, in a negative way, we have outbeat New York, even with how many lifers that we send to prison from this state. And of course, Philadelphia is the top supplier of people that are incarcerated from this state. So I leave you with this information. I thank you all for coming here, and please generously donate. So not just to the Amistad Law Center, Law Project, but also like any community organizations that you're involved in or you see on the street, or you hear about. So even if you're donating like $5 a month, I have like a plan where I'm donating. I know it's so petty, $5 to PBS every month. It just comes right out my account. I volunteer at the library in my neighborhood. And I mean, if you can't donate money, then just try to donate some time to some of these community organizations to help them survive. So thank you.
So I have a couple things I want to ask you about your research and open it to everyone else who's here. I was thinking about asking like what first inspired your interest in the topic, but I think we got an idea of that. So I was interested in, and you sort of answered this toward the end, but like, could you talk more about the relationship between gentrification and gun violence? I feel like as you're toward the end talking about how no longer producing, agriculture industry leads into this cycle where it's useful for the production of the professional class and keeping people into the tax base for that reason. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done enough research about the connection between like slum clearance, urban renewal, gentrification, and then people being displaced. But I do think there is, I don't know, I've been blacklisted. I'm sure I've been blacklisted, all the stuff I've been saying. But I mean, I do think in many ways it's intentional because, I mean, we could have mixed income communities and it'd be okay. We don't even have to have like mixed income communities. You can have equally income communities. I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but it's just this idea that some people don't want to share, they don't want to live or be amongst certain groups of people, and they're willing to exploit others and restrict resources from others. And even if it means waiting it out, so waiting for certain groups of people to not be able to afford rent, not be able to take care of their property so they get repossessed or whatever, and then deciding to buy the land cheap and then renovate it for people that can't afford it, that are the original like creators of that neighborhood or the cultural like original people of that neighborhood. I should mince words, but I mean, it has always been intentional. So to think about my project, looking at like the 1920s in Philly, in one block of North Philadelphia that I researched with census records, it was completely white. The only black people that were in that neighborhood in North Philly, so like in Strawberry Mansion area, were black servants that lived in these white people's homes that had the money for a black servant. And by the 1930s, when the Great Migration has happened and black people of the middle class are slowly moving in, and these are like classy black people. One of them is a music teacher, one is a realtor, one is a dressmaker. They're moving into this block, and you have white people that lived there for like 10, 20, 30 years in that part of North Philly, picking up and leaving. One guy, I shouldn't even mention this, it's in the book, but he actually moved to 4 different places in North Philly over the course of 20 years just to escape black neighbors. And to think about that, like that takes a lot of effort and a lot of money to keep moving from house to house just to avoid black neighbors. And to think about people still finding ways to actively do that, and then wanting that same land and wanting to renovated for people like them and intentionally making the property expensive, it just shows, like, I don't know, the baseness of human, like, I don't know, human vice or something. I don't know. It's too many SAT words, but.
Could you tell us about what your research points to as, and I think some of this is intuitive, but I don't want to presume, like, what is the cause of gang violence? So you're seeing, you know, one thing you mentioned was people enforcing the racial borders of neighborhoods. I thought that was really interesting, because then you have, like, the youth basically doing the violence that their parents who are more established in the area might not, like, want to do themselves. So it's like it creates a problem, but then they can sort of benefit from that problem the same way. It was sort of contemporary parallel that, you know, the professional class is benefiting from having people engage in recidivism and so forth. But I'm just interested in, like, as you're seeing this explosion of gang membership and gang violence in Philadelphia in the 50s and 60s, what does your research point to as, like, causing that?
Yeah, so in the 1920s, like, the social workers and the settlement house workers, they learned that, and they're using sociological texts to help piece together this info. It's because that housing is really expensive, it's segregated, it's of poor quality, and in addition to parents or even single parents trying to pay for that housing and working all of these hours, they don't have the time to supervise kids. The schools that they're attending are slowly becoming more segregated, defunded, and not giving quality instruction. And for that reason, these schools are not educating youth about other things that they can do, about pursuing careers that will benefit them in the long run. You also have youth that don't have recreation, and one of the big problems that pops up in the 30s and onward is that if the recreation in even Philadelphia is segregated, so maybe not by law but by tradition, where a teenager or a young kid could get into a fight, be forced away by a gang or a group of kids to not go to a certain swimming pool or playground, and there's a case or two in the book about that, then that means that basically they have nowhere to play, so they're out on the street, they're hanging out on the corners, they're hanging outside of movie theaters, sometimes around vacant lots. And then if they know that their parents are struggling with food insecurity or with housing, they may, not just out of need but out of frustration, decide that they're going to steal or rob or engage in some kind of criminal activity to kind of express themselves in that way. So putting all of that information together and then talking about, like, the social ostracism part of it that sociologists talk about, people not feeling welcome in their own community or treated as equal, or considered with social welfare, it leads them to also have, like, an antisocial behavior that leads towards criminal activity and violence. So putting all of those pieces together, and of course I'm not the best with this, but piecing something together to kind of explain why that gang activity is happening, is why I did that. And you even have some adults that are even kind of allowing these gang activities to happen or encouraging it. So even when youth are making zip guns, some of the ways that they're even learning how to create an improvisational gun is from these World War II veterans.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, so Carl Sudler, he wrote about New York and gangs and juveniles, and he explicitly mentions that some World War II veterans brought home guns from when they served in the war, and that's part of the reason why there was an underground market for these guns proliferating society afterward. So in addition to that going on, you also have some World War II veterans that experienced segregation, experienced violence from other teenage gang members or youths from the other neighborhoods, and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna help you figure out how to protect yourself in this neighborhood. And that's why we have some of those issues reoccurring each generation.
Wow. one last thing before I open it to everyone. So you mentioned, police corruption, and I'm interested in your engagement with the archive, because obviously, for the most part, the police department isn't going to say that we have a corruption problem.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get access to sources that express and confirm that information?
Yeah, so I use mostly the Public Interest Law Center's documents. So they also had, in addition to the police project, they had letters that they wrote to the commissioner, to city officials like Rizzo, and they actually interviewed their clients and wrote out the details, wrote out the officer's name, their badge number, what the offense was. I also looked at recent documents that were done about the police department. So there was a document that came out, I think in 2022, after Walter Wallace was shot and killed by police in West Philly. And the city controller worked with community members to hire a firm to investigate the police department, its spending, a little bit about training, and they uncovered a lot of spending that was mismanaged. So one of the things that they did discover too was, and also journalists are doing work too, so looking at their news articles, but one of the things they discovered with the police and the firm investigating the police department is that many of these neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color, they often have fewer police officers in the police stations, and they also have higher wait times. People that call 911 have higher wait times than people that are in middle and upper class neighborhoods that tend to be majority white. And there's two charts in the back of the book that I got permission, but I put them in the book, and it shows that the whiter the neighborhood in Philadelphia gets, the lower the police time is. So there's 6 different types of priority calls. Priority 1 calls are for murder. Priority 6 is for nuisance calls, so maybe loud noise, trash, or something. So if we're talking about priority 6 calls, some people are waiting almost 2 hours for police just to show up to do a police report and investigation. And I think for priority 1 calls, I have to check in the book, but it could be for neighborhoods that have maybe 70 to 90% people of color, maybe 40 minutes at the most of a wait time for priority 1. So that's crazy. In addition to journalists talking about there being from, I'm looking at notes, from 2011 to 2019, there being about 170 cases of police misconduct. And then even adding to that from 2017 to 2022 alone, the city spent over $108 million on settlement and litigation costs as a result of the police department getting caught up in corruption and abuse, and the city having to pay out that stuff. So thinking about just $108 million, they want to close schools. You have schools that have brown water, have asbestos, and that money could have went to something else, and instead of trying to pay for court costs and reimburse families that lost someone to police violence, or even in some cases the city is paying out back pay to officers that were put on leave while these cases were being processed. So thinking about all of those millions of dollars that get wasted, especially now when you have some politicians that are assuming that there's waste where there is not, and cutting things, it's just crazy.
A lot to think about. Colin?
Hi, thank you for your talk. Let's see. I guess I was really compelled by the conclusion you have of this extraction of profits from sickness, trauma, all that. Found that really compelling, and I was just thinking also how in your presentation I saw the photo gang gang members getting treated at the general hospital no longer exists. Hahnemann Hospital no longer exists. And so we had all these like public health institutions that are now turned over to private, stuff. And I don't know, it's just also thinking how like your study began kind of the beginning of this like neoliberal economic order. And now we're at, I don't know, some sort of shift, right? Like something's happening right now. So over the course of that time, like finance capital just getting even more vampiric. Do you think there's a connection between that and like, I don't know, just maybe how the character of gun violence has shifted or not shifted? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. That's a tough question.
Sorry.
I would agree with you. I would assume that neoliberal era, like fusing with like that after the civil rights movement and like some officials in government, and of course this happens around the Moynihan Report time period, thinking that, oh, of course people of color have faced structural violence, but the fact that they're engaging, and I'm specifically using this word, rioting, they're undeserving, and therefore that's one reason why we should defund social welfare programs. So just thinking, I guess, I don't know, people prioritizing certain groups of people that will generate wealth more than others, and having, like, in this case, historical examples, even if it happened last year, it becomes historical. Having those examples to justify, like, the reasoning for doing this financial / like immoral government action makes it legal in a way.
Yeah. I have two questions, just like related to things you spoke about, to see if you could tell us more about them. The first was the organization that existed for like 7 years through the DA's office funding. I was wondering if you had any other examples you came across in your research of like times where basically things that are related to the police budget were kind of sidelined for things that actually supported the community. And then the other thing was about if you found any more recent research or like journalistic exposing of people like using overtime like in a very like to continue policing way, like how you saw, like did those journals exposing it at different times like change things that much, or is it like still happening to the same degree, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I would say thank you for the question. It's a good question. There were like some other institutions I mentioned in the book that were short-lived and relied heavily on government funding from the city, and if their budget was made up of 50% or more of funding from the government, then they were on like the chopping block, and then eventually closed. So there's a list of them. One of them that existed around Temple was called Can Do, and they're the ones that worked with the Temple College students to make the Dig This newspaper. So they don't exist anymore. But funding for, so there were a bunch of programs. There was also one called the Crisis Intervention Network that also tackled gun violence and gang activity, and that was kind of in the late 70s into the 80s and 90s. That doesn't exist anymore, but they kind of worked with a formula of trying to get more private funding or grants directly given to them versus the city in order to survive for 10 plus years. But one institution that is also in West Philly is the House of Emoja, which is a group home. And basically, Falaka Fatah and her husband, David Fatah, she was a journalist, he was an activist, and Falaka Fatah is still alive today. She's in her 90s. The House of Emoja was started in the 60s. It still exists today. They rely on a lot of outside grants and also private funding to provide not just shelter for gang members or troubled youth, but also they do recreation. They offer beds and food. They put youth on like a family schedule. They have chores. They take them on trips. They give them allowance. They have like rules that they follow in an Afrocentric manner. And they even did like an exchange program, I think in the 80s, where they sent some youth from their center to Ireland and brought over youth in order to learn about gang issues and try to rehabilitate them. So that's one institution from the 60s that has actually made it, and they just had to resort to doing their own fundraising and looking for grants on their own, and just learning from like the librarians that I talk to when I do volunteering. They're also trying to look for outside funding. And one thing that they do is that some of these librarians that are at the branch now, I mean, they've been shifting them out and sending them to the central branch, which kind of gets on my nerves. But what these new librarians that have started working at my branch now is that they have become gangster to the point where they're going to restaurants and other local organizations and asking for things that they need to help make the events that they offer. So like yoga, so book events, history events, they're asking them to donate things, and then they publicize the work that they do in the community, and that is like a giving back to that organization, because they're telling community members, support this place because they gave us food for this event that had kids and adults. They've donated this, they've donated that, without wanting anything in return. So that's been what people have been doing that I've noticed.
Yeah. Once again, thank you for being here, for sharing your work as well as your personal connection. I loved the story about the North Philly Peace Park holding a program similar to that, and I was really struck by how a lot of these interventions, we have the same things today, right? Hangouts for youth, job trainings, elders trying to negotiate truces or healthy conflict resolution. My question is, during your research, did you look into any of the organizations in the 70s and 80s that were trying to do more structural change, where it was how do we change these systems rather than kind of reactively responding to the capitalist exploitation and extraction from our communities that's at the root of these problems? And if you did learn about these organizations, what can we learn about them, like learn from them for our movements today?
Thank you. So I didn't do enough research on that. So I know that many of these organizations, they were inspired by the Black Panther Party. And there was a Young Lords chapter here too, but they were kind of short-lived. But some organizations like Safe Streets, because they were so tied up with the city, and some of them had police that were working there too. It was hard for them to take like a radical or like a kind of approach to mess up the structure of that racism and other defunding that was going on. But I know of one individual that's in the book. Her name is Helen Corprew. She was a social worker, and she worked for the city in the 70s into the 80s. She tried to create a program that worked within the city's system called STEPS, so Start Towards Eliminating Past Setbacks, and basically trying to get Black youth, because that was the major demographic that was affected. So trying to get Black youth that were often boys connected to Black men to learn a trade or some other skill that they can use for a career in the future. So she kind of was running it on her own. She even resorted to the newspaper and the radio to promote it, and because it didn't really upset anyone like with its like rhetoric, it was able to exist, but it was also short-lived. So I still need to do more research, but it's often these organizations that are not affiliated with the city or don't have any city workers that are able to go full radical and try to upset the government, I guess.
Yeah. Did any of your research involve MOVE or?
So I intentionally avoid MOVE because that's a big thing to handle, and I wasn't prepared to go into that. So that's kind of why the book strategically stops at 1978. But I know other people have handled it better, so I'd rather leave it to them to.
You could do an amazing job. Next book.
Thanks.
I also just want to reiterate that it was a great talk, and I really appreciated hearing all of your stories. I was especially compelled by the slide you have showing Rizzo's kind of two-sided agenda with inflated police and prison budgets on one side, and then like the revitalization of infrastructure like hospitals and public transit on the other side, and both you framed them as like appeals to the white middle class to stay in Philadelphia to increase the tax base. And I guess I was wondering if there was anything in your research that indicated that that playbook has been replicated either in the intervening decades by other Philly politicians or even today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I mean, so it was around the mayoral administration of Richardson Dilworth in the 50s where that real estate investment kind of starts, and then the tough on crime period. And there's a story that also takes place in West Philly that kind of triggers the tough on crime and real estate investment thing. But of course, like, I've been reading more about the 80s and the 90s to do this graffiti project, and it's also again trying to talk about catering to like the ideal resident in the city, which is going to be middle and upper class and white. And for the graffiti project that I'm researching in the 80s, there's this anti-graffiti network that's created. So it's like a mural arts program. So having former graffiti artists be kind of coaxed into swearing away from doing graffiti, signing oaths, and trying to reform themselves and recruit other people to do murals. And then on the other hand, from the 80s into the 90s with Mayor Good and also with Rendell. And I am a fan of Rendell, but I got upset when I read about what happens. They're actually creating graffiti courts where they're offering like fines and to the point of jail time for people that engage in graffiti, and also forcing some graffiti artists to I mean, there was some movements in the 70s of having graffiti artists do probation work or pay for their crimes by cleaning up graffiti. But in the 90s, you have Rendell even trying to mandate that people with their private properties, especially in tourist areas, clean up graffiti, even if it's their right to have it there, even if they commissioned graffiti artwork. So even thinking about like mayors and city officials even trying to aggressively force like private citizens to remove graffiti because it supposedly is going to steer away tourists that are bringing money and maybe other investors to the city, other taxpayers. It just shows again that even if it's not gangs, then it's graffiti or something that may upset the ideal citizen or investor for the city. So I'm still going through that more. And then again with the arena thing that just happened recently, so I'm not an expert on this, but just thinking about how you had all of these community activists, residents, people in Chinatown going to the town hall meetings, protesting, saying they don't want this here. And I mean, there's other options. I mean, find somewhere in South Philly to put it. They could have put it in North Philly with all of this vacant space that exists there. But to think that they were even willing to like disregard, and I'm kind of upset with the mayor about that and other city officials, including the ones that are, they might not be black or white, but they're still a person of color, and they supported that arena program and were willing to see that neighborhood face gentrification, erasure, and then along with that arena would have came more police to protect the people that would have been utilizing the arena. It just shows like how this is really a black and white city, and how money is always superseding what matters. Even to the point, and I did kind of cut myself off, where they were disregarding, because I went to a town hall meeting, and they said putting the arena in that spot would have been a tight fit because the streets are too small. There's also the issue with the traffic and the hospitals not being able to move patients to where they need to go. So thinking about all of that stuff and people still disregarding that for money, and it wasn't even going to be that much like of a tax benefit. It was less than, it was like 290 million supposedly was going to come into the city, and then the city often likes to give out all these gifts to investors, like tax abatement for 10 years. and then they might pick up and leave after 10 years and didn't pay any taxes. So it's just problem after problem.
I think, yeah, strictly. You got your hand up, bro, for longer. Okay. Thank you so much for talking. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot. I feel like a common theme that I've been hearing a lot throughout like this conversation, this discussion, is like this obsession by like city officials to like gentrify the city and make it appealing to like property owners and developers and whatnot. And like a big part of that is like a result of like the broken windows theory. And I know like a very I don't know if it's like an understated result of that, but like I know that something that came out of that is like the zero tolerance policy in schools, especially here in Philly, where that sort of approach to disciplining students really like led to like the school to prison pipeline. And I know that like up until 2012, which is when Pennsylvania officially got rid of zero tolerance policies, like juvenile arrests were, but like the majority of those cases were at school, and that's like where a lot of like that's where that pipeline started, and that's where it happened. So I wanted to learn more about like that phenomenon in the context of your research, and like what through like the things that you've learned about like informs like just more about like that school to prison pipeline and how it still may be relevant today, and like to what extent, and how it started, and you know how it's evolved since then.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, I'll try to keep it brief, but I mean, I didn't put a whole lot about schools, but I was kind of informed by my own experiences. So even though I went to 2 magnet schools for middle and high school, we even had metal detectors in middle school and high school. And even in high school, sometimes they would have like a wand where they'll, if you seem to go off for whatever reason. So just having that to walk into school, and then having security guards. I mean, I know in some cases it's necessary, but just having them there on the school property is also suggesting that your student population is prone to criminality. And then, like I kind of mentioned in the story I told earlier, like having neighborhoods get less resources because of how the tax system is set up, where depending on which neighborhood you live in, the more taxes you pay, the more resources you get poured back into schools. And Germantown, I still live there, it's like a lower working class, in some cases there's middle class people there too. But because it's not a high tax base, and one of the closest neighborhoods is Chestnut Hill, because it's not like Chestnut Hill that is middle and upper class, it's not going to get the same funding for schools. And as a result, you have students, whether they want to or not, be put on a low track system and get less investment. Even though what should happen is every school gets equal funding, and then if it is a school that needs more stuff, it should get more funding than other schools. But that again doesn't happen because of that structural system tied to economics. So just thinking about like, it's not really, I mean, I guess it is a prison, it is a school to prison pipeline. It's just like an implicit way of doing it. So by defunding it, by just turning a blind eye to the issues within the school, even if you have journalists, you have parents, you have students complaining about the stuff, and it just still doesn't get fixed. And Germantown High School, it's actually closed. It closed, I don't know, maybe 7 or more years ago. And guess who now has the land? A private developer that's going to make it into 240 apartments and some other mixed-use space. So that's crazy, right? And that school missed its 100th anniversary of being in existence. And it was at one point a school that was, of course it was in its early years mostly white, but then it was one of the schools celebrated for being an integrated space. And then it shifted by the 70s into being a mostly black school. Yeah.
Oh,
sure. Yeah. I'll try to be quick. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing some history about the city we live in, and some of your own history with it. I especially appreciated all of the details about like the alternate responses, like the sort of like alternative visions of how we could respond to crime. I thought a lot of that was new to me, and it was great to hear. I mean, it, as you mentioned, was defeated, unfortunately, in Philly, and that reminded me of the more recent, I think, movement for an alternative vision of addressing crime that was defeated, defund the police, which was, I think, defeated nationally and locally with the election of Terrell Parker. I guess I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about, what led to the defeat of that vision for how we could respond to crime, how the Teflon crime Rizzo approach ended up winning out, and if you have any lessons that you feel like you learned from going through that history, I would love to hear about those, so we can try and make sure that the next movement, the next vision, isn't defeated.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try not to rant, but I think part of it. I think part of it is because city officials generationally keep burdening the next generation about you need to solve this balancing of the budget. You need to get more residents in. You need to check all of these boxes, and they kind of forget about the lower level issues that will eventually help the upper level problems, solve the upper level problems. So I think people are too much geared towards results, and like with the gang problem, they kind of wanted to see results within a few years, so maybe less than 5 years, and that's not possible when you just start an anti-gang program or multiple ones, and it takes a while to rehabilitate people and to change a whole culture and generation. It might even take at least 10 years for programs like Safe Streets to actually have what they needed, and they often even operated on a shoestring budget, so they could have had a wider reach if they had more centers, more money, and so on. So thinking about that, and then also I would say just Philly officials keep looking at other cities and trying to compare themselves to others. And I don't know, being a Philly person, it's always New York is who we keep comparing ourselves to. And even the SEPTA revolution thing, I have a problem with that too. Even you're gonna change the number letter system because New York has that system and it seems to work better. And at one point that bus revolution was gonna disrupt how people travel, how they get to work, to school, even the elderly. There were a few bus routes in my neighborhood they were trying to cut or reroute, and it was clearly going to go past major residential apartments and houses, and basically elderly people in wheelchairs were going to have to either walk several blocks or basically pay for a Uber or a Lyft that they can't afford because you're trying to reroute the bus. And then there was even a bus route, the 47 and the 47M, that goes from North Philly to South Philly. It goes through the Italian Market because I like to go there. But besides that, thinking about how you might have people that live in North Philly that work in South Philly, you cut that route, they can't get to work. Or some of the bus routes that were in Germantown that go into Cheltenham Township, they were going to cut that. If you cut that, they can't get to work. So it's you don't want them to even work. You're hoping that someone else gets their job, and then they're displaced and everything else. But just thinking about that, and in general, Philadelphia constantly comparing itself to other cities. And again, with the case with New York, New York has a larger budget. They have multiple ways of garnering income. There's no way that Philly can structure itself to operate like New York because of that. And they have millions of people and more traffic than we do. So for city officials to even think that they can operate like New York and try to replicate their identity is part of the problem as well.
Dr. Dirkson, thank you so much for your work and for grounding us with Terrence's story at the beginning of this discussion. I wanted to talk about your conclusion a little bit. I think presenting that conclusion in this space, which is clearly like a safe leftist space, we can hear that and be like, oh, totally agreed. But the radicality of what you're saying does not like miss me. And I think, and by radical, I mean the truth telling of what you're saying. What has been the reception of your book more broadly? What's been the reception in academic spaces? And have there been any consequences for you personally as a result of occupying this kind of space you have as a historian?
Thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, I haven't. So the one thing about me is that I don't really like to find out about reviews. So I don't really know what people think unless it's like a close friend or family member that told me what they thought about the book. But I mean, I guess in general it's been okay. I tried to go like reach out to different spaces. Mostly it's been libraries where I've been successful to get to talk about the project. But I don't know. I feel like part of the problem why the book could go further than it has is the price of the book, and that's kind of one thing that gets on my nerves. Because it's academic press, they're trying to make as much money as possible for the hardcover, and hopefully with the paperback it'll be a lot cheaper. But I think I've talked to other people publicly about the topic, and I mean, I feel like they're on the same page with me, but this is mostly like people in working class or community spaces. Like you said, they're also leftists. But from city officials, I haven't heard anything. I hopefully I won't hear anything. I'm not trying to get any letters or anything. I tried to make sure I checked all the boxes about what I put in the book, but just using the actual city documents, including that investigation from 2022, and making sure I actually read it properly and cited it properly, I think that has been one reason why I haven't got any public backlash from city officials or police. I did kind of hear about some police officers hearing about the book, but when I did hear about them reading it or what the topic was about, and they were able to digest what I wrote, they kind of were on the defensive and trying to advocate for more community-centric stuff. So I guess I did a good job to the point where I won't be sued, but it just convicted them to the point where they need to be less, if they were brutal, less brutal and more community-oriented and looking for other outlets to manage crime rather than just going straight for arrest and incarceration. But I haven't really heard anything, and I hope not to.
That did remind me. How much time we got? Okay. I was going to ask, because largely the book and the conversations focus on street gangs, and I was sort of curious about if there were any intersecting or overlapping problems with gang violence as relates to, like, you know, the mafia as operated in Philly, other organized crime ventures, the Philadelphia Black Mafia, even
The nation. NOI.
well, that's it. But So was that a part of the story at all that you uncovered in your research, or that?
So I did read a little bit about that, but it was kind of going to go off topic. I would have to do another project, but I would consider the mob a gang. The Black Mafia, has an interesting history. So Sean Patrick Griffin wrote a book about the Black Mafia in Philly. And there, in some ways, so on one hand, you had the juvenile gangs in the 60s and the 70s that were prevalent. By the 70s into the 80s, the Black Mafia, some of the members come out of Philadelphia's Nation of Islam, and they're involved in dealing drugs and other, racketeering stuff, and they're connected to New York and Jersey, with their trafficking. But one thing that they did do to kind of throw people off their trail was the Black Mafia members created a Black Brothers Inc. organization, which was like a front for their real organization. So the Black Brothers Inc. was supposed to be like an anti-gang kind of organization. So they were appearing to do community work, but in a way they were also continuing their crimes, and that kind of makes the story more complicated. In addition to some black mafia members not only being annoyed with juvenile gangs because they messed up drug sales, but finding a way to kind of solve that problem negatively by recruiting them into being drug dealers or getting them addicted to drugs. So it's just like a cycle of victimization that kind of continues even within the community. So thinking about that, and then you have the Italian mafia, and then there's a bunch of cases in the 80s where the Italian mafia is in the news for like all of the public violence. So houses being blown up, people being shot in cars and things like that. And I don't know, I would have to come up with a project that kind of sinks it, because in a way that history gets glorified in Philly history, but the black mafia and violence gets demonized as well. But I mean, I don't know, I feel like all of those are issues of people feeling isolated and excluded, and also seeking underground ways to solve issues of poverty. Even with the mafia, I mean, there's more of a generational history to uncover with that, but it's kind of the same things. But yeah.
So, I asked this question to somebody who did not grow up in the city, and you have, and also you've done a lot of research into a lot of the problems and issues we're talking about right now. I was here in the city for the mayoral election, and I remember in like the weeks leading up to that, how there seemed to be like a disconnect between what progressives were saying in that race and what Cheryl Parker was saying in that race. And it's not like she actually won an outright majority, right, of like the votes, but she did win it. And it seemed really clear in the aftermath that progressives and people on the left didn't have a really clear answer to the issues of crime and safety that she was talking about and her proposed solutions to those issues. And I noticed a little bit more when I was canvassing with Working Families Party in anticipation of like Harris's election, because I would often like canvass someone called Rashida, which Kirsten knows, yeah. And I remember we talked about that one time. Like we were talking about that sort of like disconnect one day when we were out canvassing, because I was noticing that for a lot of people that I talked to door to door, they were bringing up these very real issues. They're like, yeah, crime is a really big really big concern in my community, for me and my family, etc. And their proposed solutions were, yeah, like we need to look to the police for that. And it wasn't because they had any sort of affinity or love for the police. It's just because like that's something that like an institution that they understood, even in like all of its imperfections. I remember talking to Rashida about that, and she was like, yeah, I get really annoyed sometimes with the way that progressives and people on the left talk about crime in Philly, because for me, and I'm quoting her here, she was like, for me and for a lot of people that I know, it is a very spectacular, it's a miraculous thing if we don't hear of somebody that we know that's passed away over the summer or like over the course of like a year. Like that never happens. So for people to tell us and try to talk to us about these issues and with a certain kind of like arrogance, kind of is very alienating and disconnecting. It doesn't speak to me or the people that I know. And I remember hearing that and being really struck by it. So I wanted to ask you if there are like mistakes or errors that people who might not have grown up in the city, people that are white, people that don't really experience these issues that you talk about like really directly firsthand, make in trying to address and talk about crime in Philadelphia and public safety in general.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say, like, I mean, in general, so not really with the city, like the Congress people, but like for mayor, like it's kind of like basically you if you're going to get elected as mayor in Philly, in my opinion, is you got to be a Democrat. You have to either be born and raised in the city or strongly tied to it, and be able to have like that Philly credibility, which is like people like Rendell, born in New York, but he's still able, because he was rooted so many years in Philly in government, he's still able to become mayor. And you have to be able to like navigate both spaces. So be aware that crime exists and that people have real experiences with crime. But then again, some people, just because they are afraid of crime, they don't want crime and they want some action taken against it, they're not fans of the police. So it's like you have to be able to navigate both spaces. And I think that's what Parker did. she talked about crime one way and like the neighborhoods of color, and then she went to the Northeast and she said something else. And it's like you have to be able to do that because you won't get the whole city on board to vote for you. And I know it's not a good thing, but that's the way it is in the cities. Like you have to be rooted in the city. It has to be believable that you're all for the city. You have to be Democrat. You have to have like a working class flair in a way. And then talking about crime and handling crime, because even working class people have experienced crime. So even like not just street crime, but like in schools, like on public transportation, at work, even like sometimes just I mean I don't know. In some ways, like Philly people have a certain aggression too, as well, and it's kind of like a personality based on experiences, and just knowing that you can't be too rough or insultory to other people because you expect there to be a retaliation that could be violent or involve gun violence. That means that it has happened before. There's the potential for it to happen again. And then knowing that it has happened, maybe not to people that are close to you, but it has happened, you want crime to be solved, whether you like police or not. So I don't know if that even made sense, but it's just like that twofold thing where you know there's crime, you may have witnessed crime, you know you've heard of it, you don't want that to keep happening, and you're willing to vote for a candidate that is somewhat tough on crime, but you just hope that they won't be that outright right wing crime, like pro-crime activist that's going to terrorize the city. So it's like you're taking a gamble because the other pieces seem to fit right. And it's just that's just the culture here, I would say.
Any final questions? Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Menika.